How does a respected general convince himself that murder is justice? How does love turn into execution? This is not just jealousy. This is what happens when someone is watched so closely that they begin to fracture from the inside. In Othello, written by Shakespeare, the tragedy is often interpreted as a story of jealousy. However, jealousy is not the root cause of Othello's violence. We can call it a symptom. The deeper force driving the tragedy in Othello is not jealousy, like I said, it's his internalized racism towards himself. And yes, I said what I said. Surrounded by Venetian prejudice, Othello gradually observes to believe that his blackness makes him inferior, unstable, or like unworthy of Desdemona's love. As he begins to himself through the racist lenses of societies that never fully accepts him, his insecurity transforms into surveillance, and then into some kind of self-disgust, and finally into moral distortion. And evidence will show you why. But first, let's rewind a bit because to understand how this happened, we have to understand where it all started. Othello takes place in Venice. Othello is a Moorish general in the Venetian army. He has military authority, political respect, and public honor. He is trusted to defend the state from invasion. Yet, socially, he is never fully accepted. So basically, the story goes like this. Othello is the general and secretly marries Desdemona. Iago is jealous or resentful of Othello, so basically plans some kind of revenge to mess up Othello's life. Iago poisons his mind into believing that Desdemona is cheating on him, making Othello jealous, and that leads to tragedy. That's to make the summary short. However, it's not really about jealousy because before he even appears on stage, he is described in racialized and animalistic language. Even now, very now, an old black ram is topping your white ewe. You'll have your daughter covered in very horse, thick lips. Repencho, Desdemona's father, which does not support the marriage, by the way, warns Othello, look to her more. If thou hast eyes to see, she has deceived her father and made thee. From the beginning, his marriage is portrayed as unnatural. So ask yourself, if your relationship is constantly questioned, if your identity is constantly racialized, if your belonging is always conditional, how does that shape your self-perception? Moving on, at first, Othello appears composed. Rude am I in my speech. Later, happily for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation that chambers have. He begins comparing himself to Venetian men, and concludes he's lacking because of his blackness. I think my wife be honest, and think she's not. Doubts enter before proof does. However, to understand how societal expectations shape identity and decision making, I decided to interview my professor Matias from Regis University's Anderson College, who specializes in business, leadership, and I met him through my international management class.
You're constantly observed. I think it diminishes your personal strength and your personal confidence. And there's a variation because none of these things are absolute. So if somebody, like if you're a child and somebody's watching you, that's a different perspective, right? Because they need it. But for an average adult, when you are supervised, when you're watched a lot, it is not good for your self-confidence or for building your own strength. I think as a society, we really encourage people to come across, especially in the US, come across as confident, make yourself big, talk a big game. And I think there's a lot of social pressure around that. But that can also backfire because a lot of people do that and they don't have the knowledge. And generally, as human beings, we are hardwired to pay more attention and to believe people who come across as confident. So it's a natural shortcoming on our part. Works most of the time, but it has terrible consequences if you follow people or if you believe them just because of their appearance and their sort of overconfidence. I would say that depends on what you mean by constant. If it is just regular basis, it can be very good. And if that's something, for example, if I tell you, hey, Alma, give me the feedback. How am I doing in this interview? Give me feedback, right? I'm looking for it. And it would be helpful to say, hey, you're talking too much. You're talking too fast. You don't have eye contact. That would be helpful for me. But that person has to have self confidence to do that. If I already don't have much self confidence, then that can be very destructive. It can come across as criticism, and people generally then start to just lose any of the confidence that they have. So it's not an easy answer, but I think it depends on how that criticism or observations are given, and then how much that person wants it.
So, to further explore Othello's psychological transformation, I also interviewed Othello's therapist. During the conversation, I asked several questions. I would say that constant evaluation can create some type of hyper awareness. When individuals feel different or observed, they might overcompensate by appearing confident, but internally, however, this pressure can intensify security. And in Othello's, as his position as a black general in Venetian society, it likely highness this dynamic, I would say. Yes, when authority feels fragile, individuals become more sensitive to threat, and manipulators can exploit hidden fears. And in this case, I believe Iago does not create Othello's insecurity. He just simply, we can call it like he amplifies it, yeah. When individuals absorb negative stereotypes, those beliefs can unconsciously shape decisions. Harmful actions may begin to feel justified or necessary. For example, this can mirror Othello's final justification of murder. As insecurity deepens, Othello's imagery becomes grotesque and somewhat self directed. For example, when he says, her name, that was as fresh as Diane's visage, is now begrimed and black as my own face. He equates blackness with corruption and now equates himself to stain. And the one of the most disturbing metaphors on the play has to be when he says, I had rather be a Todd and live upon the vapor of the dungeon than keep a corner in the thing I love for other uses. The toad imagery reflects self-loathing. The dungeon vapor suggests suffocation in a way and psychological confinement. He imagines himself as something filthy rather than emotionally vulnerable. And when he says chaos is come again, internal order collapses, identity destabilizes, and this is no longer about suspicion. This is about self erasure. Postcolonial scholar Anya Lumba argues in Shakespeare, Race, and Colonialism that Othello is produced as different before he can even define himself, and ultimately internalizes the discourse that marginalizes him. Lumba is a professor of English and postcolonial studies and is widely recognized for her work on race, empire, and early modern literature. A fun fact about her career is that she held academic positions at major universities, including the University of Pennsylvania, and is considered one of the leading voices in Shakespeare and race studies today. Similarly, Edward Said, author of Orientalism, developed one of the most influential theories in postcolonial studies. Said was a professor at Columbia University and helped establish the field of postcolonial criticism. A well-known fact about him is that Orientalism, written in 1978, transformed literary and cultural studies by explaining how Western societies construct the East as inferior or exotic to justify dominance. These scholars straighten the argument that Othello's tragedy is not purely personal. It is shaped by a broader system of racial ideology. Lumba helps explain how Othello internalizes Venetian prejudice. Said explains how societies create the other and how the construction can eventually shape self perception. Together, their scholarships support The idea that Othello's violence is the result of internalized oppression and not simply jealousy. We can say that some argue that Othello is fundamentally and only about jealousy and manipulation. We can say Iago clearly engineers the plot, and then the handkerchief becomes evidence, and dramatic irony drives the tension. Jealousy is something we all experience, it's universal, and it can affect anyone. However, Othello is not forced to act. He demands proof. He chooses to believe Iago. He makes the decision to kill Desdemona. Therefore, it would be inaccurate to remove his responsibility entirely. However, this interpretation overlooks the racial dimensions of his psychological breakdown. Jealousy alone does not explain and does not prove why Othello says, happily for I am black. It does not explain why blackness becomes associated with corruption. It does not explain the totem imagery, the dungeon vapor, or the self comparison to chaos. Jealousy explains suspicion. However, internalized racism explains why suspicion becomes identity collapse. Without racial insecurity, jealousy might have resulted in confrontation or dialogue. Instead, it led to moral distortion and execution framed as justice. Therefore, jealousy alone cannot account for the psychological collapse we witnessed. By the final act, Othello's reasoning has transformed completely. It is cost my soul. The repetition suggests certainty, but the cost remains undefined. It exists within ideology rather than evidence. Put out the light and then put out the light. He equates extinguishing a candle with extinguishing a life, in this case Desdemona, and also referring to Desdemona when he says she must die, else she'll betray more men. He reframes murder as prevention, as moral duty. Internalized societal beliefs reshape his moral compass. Instead of rejecting the narrative that paints him as dangerous or unstable, he enacts it. The tragedy is not only Desdemona's death, it is that Othello believes that racist ideologies surrounding him so completely that he fulfills it. We can say the tragedy did not begin in the bedroom. It began on language, it began on perception, it began on internalization. Once Othello began to see himself through society's racist lens, the outcome became inevitable. When society constantly surveils and racializes individuals, internalization becomes inevitable. If we want to prevent tragedies like Othello's, we must challenge the system that produces self doubt in the first place.